Many of you have probably heard of the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. He has a very famous saying. He says, "For things to reveal themselves to us, we need to be ready to abandon our views about them." I became interested in issues of religion and politics and state as a political scientist because I felt that we needed to revisit and maybe even abandon some of the ways that we talk about these issues. The words that we use to discuss religion and state, words like secularism, religion, tolerance, belief, faith, establishment, and religious freedom, don't map neatly onto the world that we actually live in. It's messier. These categories and concepts all hide more than they reveal. They carry lots of different ideas inside of them. They are intricate and complex in practice. So this afternoon, I'm going to focus on, given the subject of the festival, of Fall Fest, on the question of belief in the context of American efforts to promote something called religious freedom in other countries. When the United States presses for religious freedom abroad, and we have several offices that are dedicated to doing this, I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about the bureaucracy. Usually telling people stories about bureaucracy is a way to put them to sleep, especially in the mid-afternoon. So if anyone wants to hear about these offices, I can put you to sleep very quickly. But we do have a bureaucracy, let's leave it at that. But when we do this, when we press for something called religious freedom, who gets to define religion? Who gets to decide what it means to be free religiously? What if the authorities decide that your tradition isn't real religion? What happens to dissidents? What happens to doubters? What happens to those who identify with more than one tradition? Religious freedom, it turns out, is a very messy and complex concept. And I'm going to suggest today that embedded deeply in our talk of religious rights and religious freedoms is a very specific understanding of religion as belief that emerged from European Protestant Christianity and is not universal. Now, let me just say, by way of preface, for a long time I stayed far away from this topic, far away as I could. When people would say religious, oh, do you work on that? I would go hide behind the podium. I don't know anything about it. I don't want to touch it. It's intensely politicized topic for someone who works in US foreign policy. I was really uncomfortable with how so many Americans talked about religious freedom as something that we have, but others don't. It seemed like almost everyone agreed on this topic. It's a universal human right, it's a legal necessity, it's a norm, and at least in our country, it's a social fact. Again, it's something we have, but they lack. It was also something that could be measured. Religious freedom was, like the famous court case about porn, we know it when we see it. We just know it when we see it. We know religious freedom. Therefore, we can promote it, we can legalize it, we can secure it, and we can legally guarantee it, as the lawyers say. It's so easy to fall in line with this story. After all, shouldn't recalcitrant and nasty governments overseas be persuaded to comply with this basic universal human right? Shouldn't societies and states that risk slipping into religious persecution, driven by old hatreds or intolerant theologies, be nudged or even maybe shoved into compliance with this universal norm? Won't this bring peace and prosperity, even economic growth, many argue, even if it's a little messy in the short term? Religious freedom, American style, is a very powerful language of reform, renewal, and redemption. It has deep roots in the myth of American exceptionalism. It helps constitute that myth. And it also isn't new. During the Cold War, it turns out, we fought to secure what the US government called global spiritual health. It wasn't called religious freedom, it was called global spiritual health, of course, to combat communism and to bring freedom. Today, of course, we promote religious freedom, which is understood as the right to choose one's belief or one's unbelief. Belief, to believe, to not believe, to choose one's belief, to choose one's unbelief. Now I understand better, after spending 10 years researching this topic, why I shied away from the idea that religious freedom can be distilled into the freedom to believe or not. I shied away from the idea that it could be imposed and realized as a universal prescription for how to finally live together peacefully. The right to religious freedom, as the right to believe or not, never resonated with me personally either. I grew up in the Midwest, in Minneapolis, perched somewhat self-consciously between Catholicism and Judaism, with a mostly non-observant parent from each tradition. I found myself occupying the precarious spaces within and between religions, and between religion and non-religion, depending on where I was, what day it was, what holiday it was, who I was with. I was at Mass with my Catholic grandmother in small-town Iowa, or at the breakfast table at home in Minneapolis, wondering if I should wish my thoughtful, agnostic Jewish father a happy Easter, or in the fall, a happy New Year. At school, when a fellow fourth grader in public schools in Minneapolis said, "What religion are you?" I was nervous. I tried to explain. He looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, "But you do believe in Jesus, right?" "Yes," I said nervously. He was bigger than me. I wasn't sure what that meant. I'm not sure he knew either. But I felt let down somehow after I said yes, and yet not. I'd been forced to give something up or not. I ended up in graduate school studying political theory and international relations, attracted more and more to questions around secularism, politics, religious diversity, and difference. I became more aware of how many forms of politics today take for granted that there are these things out there called religions that have clean lines. There's this religion, that religion, this religion, that religion. The lines are there, they can be seen by all. I was curious about the division between religion and non-religion, what we sometimes call the secular. Being myself both diversely religious and yet, according to others, totally non-religious, my own experience cast doubt on efforts to organize ourselves publicly, socially, and politically through concepts like secularism, religious freedom. What about all the ways of being and belonging that don't fit into those rubrics, that don't rely on the difference that religion makes? This shaped all of this experience and my academic study of political theory and critical theory in particular, and later religion. This shaped how I approached international religious freedom. When I was finally, actually more than nudged, I was shoved into the topic by a whole bunch of different people coming together and saying, this is something that needs to just happen. So I took it on, and I learned quickly as a scholar that I wasn't alone in having some doubts about this concept. I read a book early on called The Impossibility of Religious Freedom by Winifred Fowler Sullivan, who is a professor of religion at Indiana and an expert in American law and American religious history. Now, Sullivan says that what makes religious freedom legally impossible is a very simple fact that we can all see. Laws managing religion have to have some way of defining and distinguishing what counts as religion. And in the US, as we all know, there is no established authority. There is no designated authority that has the power to make that determination. We have legal disestablishment. And yet, because the First Amendment reads as it does, the state and the courts are constantly forced to talk about religion all the time. Think of the Hobby Lobby case. There are so many. The court in Hobby Lobby decided that what are called closely held for-profit corporations, in other words, small family corporations, are exempt from a regulation that its owners object to on religious grounds. And this, of course, is the first time that the court has recognized a for-profit corporation's claim of religious beliefs. So corporations now have beliefs too. As Sullivan shows, the First Amendment then did not actually disestablish religion. It just didn't happen. What it did is it established a different way of talking about religion publicly. Religion is not a naturally occurring object that comes with bright borders, she says. It doesn't have a stable essence that can be pinned down. It's complicated, it's messy. So my question is what happens, and my book deals with what happens if we think globally about the complexities of defining religion. Now, we know it's complex in the US. What happens if we start moving around the world and thinking about other countries and thinking about interactions between countries? What could it possibly mean for the US government to promote something called international religious freedom in other countries? This struck me as dubitable, as maybe even impossible, and certainly deeply politicized, possibly even a recipe for making things worse, for intensifying conflict, for increasing social tensions. And this is because, of course, efforts to govern through such an unstable category that's shifting all the time actually imbues with political and social significance the very boundaries between religion and non-religion that these projects are meant to manage or to tame or to calm. So it is those very same boundaries that I found to be so complex and shifting in my own life. And I learned as I moved away from the study of politics and toward the study of religion that this is old news in religious studies. Scholars of religion, oh, Italy, there you go. Nice, let's stay on that one, especially with the weather today. Scholars of religion all agree, or almost all agree, that these boundaries between religions and non-religion, these are fuzzy and fungible boundaries. I have a colleague working on Brazil, and she wrote this: "It's unsurprising to meet a Brazilian who calls herself Catholic, belonged to an evangelical youth group as a teenager, was married by a priest, attends a local Methodist church, reads Spiritist books, draws mandalas to relax, and consults an Umbanda priest for everyday advice." End quote. This is the religion of much of the world. Whether it's Brazil, Japan, Egypt, Russia, or even Chicago, it can be really hard to classify people cleanly as believers or non-believers in a single tradition. What does this mean for efforts to secure something called international religious freedom? Well, when the US goes abroad and tries to advocate for religious freedom, we have to figure out who's going to define religion and who's going to decide what it means to be free. We also have to ask, what if the authorities, whether religious or secular, decide that your particular tradition isn't really a religion, but is just a cultural practice, or something that's kind of, outdated, that needs to be left behind, which is in fact, of course, what happened in so many colonial encounters. I'll talk about that briefly in just a minute. What about people who identify with non-orthodox versions of protected traditions? And what about traditions that have fallen out of political favor, as is the case in so many countries that can be changing with the wind? Someone is always going to struggle for air on this faith-based landscape. Whose religion does the promotion of religious freedom promote? Those are the questions that I tackle in my book, Beyond Religious Freedom. And today I'm going to make just 2 suggestions taken from that book that will help us think about the politics of belief, very specifically in the context of promoting religious freedom. First, programs that advocate for international religious freedom tend to endorse a very particular notion of the religious person as a believer or non-believer. In this understanding, which comes very naturally to us, religion is what goes on in the head and in the heart. It's also a matter of choice. One chooses to believe. It's a personal commitment, voluntary. As my colleague Sarah Imhoff pointed out to me, if you go to Wikipedia and you look up freedom of worship, you'll be redirected to the page for freedom of religion, where the very first sentence glosses freedom of religion as freedom of belief. Religion is very often collapsed into belief. Religious freedom as the right to believe or not to believe. The second idea I want to stress today is that as states around the world legally seek to protect something called religious freedom, ordinary people are obligated to conform to a very particular model of a free religious economy that is made up of believers and non-believers. It's kind of like a recipe that gets exported and imposed on different contexts. In other words, the promotion of religious freedom doesn't just go out and reflect a world that it finds out there. It creates and shapes that world. What if belief isn't necessarily the essence of all religion? What would it mean for the analysis of religious freedom advocacy if our modern construct of belief were itself a political discourse, situated in history rather than outside history as the eternal mark of the sacred? I'm going to just turn to one example of what things might look like were we to situate our modern construct of belief in this way, in history, rather than as the timeless mark of the sacred. If we do that, it becomes immediately obvious that we need to think more about people whose religion does not rest on belief at all, because these people will fail to qualify politically as religious actors under modern understandings of religious freedom. An example are the Quiche people. The Quiche are a native Maya group in Guatemala. Many of you are probably familiar with Rigoberta Menchú, won the Nobel Peace Prize back in the 90s. A few years ago, 87 of these Maya communities came together, represented by the Quiche People's Council, to reject mining and hydroelectric projects that had been proposed by foreign corporations in their land in the wake of NAFTA and a series of other related treaties. Foreign companies responded to their rejection by saying, let's just give them more money. The usual response, throw more money at them, pay them a higher percentage of the profits, get the People's Council on board, whatever it takes. They refused again. And the companies simply didn't understand that the reason that the Quiche people were opposed to their mining projects was not really financial. It wasn't about the money. It was because of their attachment to the land for religious and cultural reasons. So their refusal to let the miners in led to violence, death threats, and massive violations of their cultural heritage and land rights. There were also some assassinations. Collusion among the multinational mining corporations, many of which were Canadian, incidentally, the police and the Guatemalan state were all behind this violence and the use of force. Meanwhile, at the same time, in its 2012 Religious Freedom Report, and this is part of what the State Department does, the US government does, is we issue a Religious Freedom Report every single year on every single country in the world except for the US. So, well, obviously. So we already have, yeah, right, we've been there. So while the same exact time that all of this is going on, the State Department report on Guatemala reports no abuses of religious freedom in Guatemala whatsoever. So Quiche attachment to their land simply does not qualify for international legal protections for religious freedom. In other words, Quiche claims are politically illegible as religious claims because, in an important sense, they're seen as having literally no religion or no recognizable religion. Violations of their cultural heritage, of their land rights, of their traditions are literally inaudible in the register of international religious freedom discourse. They're invisible in that it's privileging a right to believe and not to believe. Now, some people will say to me, well, why don't we just recognize their claims? Why don't we just say, okay, the claims to their land it's religious, and so it should be protected, it's deserving of protection. And I sometimes call this religious freedom 2.0, like we can make it bigger, we can make it better, we can include everyone. But this actually, I don't think this will solve the problem. I think that we need to actually look at the situation. If we look at it really closely, you'll see that the decks have been stacked against the Quiche and in favor of the hydroelectric, monoculture, oil and mining interests that stand to gain financially from opening up Guatemala to transnational capital. This is what I call the international political economy of religious freedom. And it's the big picture that we need to look at if we want to actually consider the politics of religious freedom. It's also why we can never speak of religious freedom in the abstract, as this abstract ideal that's out there kind of floating above the world. Or rather, we can do that, but we risk losing our story. We missing the whole story. So the takeover of Quiche lands is being spearheaded by corporate interests, but they're working in lockstep with advocacy groups, including one, and if I did have words on my slides, this would be all in caps, the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. No, I'm not kidding. People are laughing. It's not a joke. They're very serious. You can look at their website. The Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, I'll talk about more what they think. But my point is that as these interests, as the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation and like-minded political allies, as they gain traction in the US government, which they certainly have recently, their understandings of religious rights, which privilege a very particular understanding of religion and a particular understanding of economic and political freedom, will prevail. They work together, the religious economies model. The Religious Freedom and Business Foundation openly advocates on behalf of a religious economies model. In other words, it sees people as consumers of religion for whom believing and belief is the defining feature of what it means to be religious, and the right to believe as the essence of what it means to be a free human being. As more and more people around the world submit to that understanding of religious freedom and to a free religious marketplace, they also submit to a more general conception of freedom itself. As Don Lopez, a historian of religion, put it very nicely, the category of belief is not so easily transferred from one society to another, and those who seek to do so are subject to the consequences of their deed. Religious freedom, it turns out, is a messy and complex concept. Embedded in our talk of religious rights is this understanding of religion and the religious individual that came out of Protestant European Christianity, and we've inherited this, and it feels natural to us, but as I said, it is not universal. The protection of international religious freedom as a universal human right thus protects some, and it does protect some, but not all. It normalizes or sanctifies even a particular religious psychology, the notion of an individual who first chooses her beliefs and then enacts them. Again, believing becomes the defining characteristic of religion, and the right to choose one's belief as the essence of what it means to be free. And this commitment to religion as belief, with all of its benefits and all of its drawbacks, helps us to understand why certain practices, like the Quiche concerns, simply fall off the map. Let me take a little quick detour into history to just emphasize something that I think people don't talk about quite enough, particularly in the study of politics, as we think about some of these religion programs and bureaucracies around the world. Not only the US, but the Europeans and others are promoting religious freedom. Belief hasn't always been the defining essence of religion. It emerged in 17th century Europe, and it took hold for many complex reasons. We can speak then of an ideology of belief. According to the anthropologist Talal Assad, in 17th century Europe, belief came to be seen as both a privilege, in that one had the privilege of choosing one's belief, and a danger at the same time, because belief could incite violence. Belief was also understood as something that could not be coerced because it was located inside in the private space of the mind and the heart. And according to this ideology of belief, religion then is an interior state of assent to certain truths. This ideology, which today seems quite natural, grew up alongside a particular understanding of the secular state. Belief was therefore a claim to civil immunity with regard to religious faith that reinforced the idea of a secular state and a particular emphasis on particular conception of religion. So, in short, what we're learning here is that the ideology of belief, a very particular, historically located and received and inherited ideology, helped to define our notion of religion as something that is independent and separate from the power of the state. There is no universal and timeless right to religious freedom understood as the right to believe or not. It's always immersed in a messy history, as we saw in Guatemala. The protection of religious freedom depends on a particular religious psychology. It depends on the autonomous subject who chooses and enacts her beliefs. But it also goes further than this, because advocacy for religious freedom, understood as the right to believe or not, helps to create subjects. It helps to create believing subjects or non-believing subjects. It incites or incentivizes people to try to figure out where they fit. Am I a believer? Am I a non-believer? Where do I fit in this picture? It helps to create faith communities. People are like, well, if I can be a faith community, there's all these goodies I can get. Let's be a faith community for whom choosing and believing becomes the defining feature of what it means to be religious. And of course, the right to choose to believe is what it means to be free. So what this does then is it forecloses, it shuts out religion without belief, and it covers over the instabilities of our notion of religious belief and the history of that notion. Who gets to decide, for example, what counts as religious belief as opposed to mere opinion or some other form of belief? Who has the authority to pronounce on what is or is not religious and thus deserving of special legal protection? Staying with history for one more moment, I mentioned earlier colonial legal history and the parallels. This is a question I get often, so I wanted to make sure to bring it up. There are very interesting parallels between today's American promotion of religious freedom and the transformative power of British colonial legal authority in the past. Colonial reforms of native traditions in British India, for example, as Jacob de Roover has explained, induced the Hindu traditions to internalize a Protestant division between the religious, the secular, and the falsely religious. In other words, aspects of native Indian traditions in colonial India that didn't fit into the newly codified model of Hindu law were rejected as illegitimate forms of Hinduism with no serious role to play in secularized Hindu law. They were rejected and relegated to the realm of false religion, sometimes called superstition or magic. In this way, de Roover argues, the institutions of secular law in colonial India contributed to the expansion of Protestantism in its moment of secularization. Rather than eradicating Hindu religion and spreading the specific doctrinal content of Protestant Christianity, its formal structures were diffused in Indian society by being infused into Hindu tradition itself. This complex admixture, this mélange, this bricolage, as the French would say, is what we actually see all over the world. Like their colonial antecedents, today's religious freedom reforms insert particular structures of religious subjectivity into different traditions in the various societies in which they're active, in which they're implemented programmatically. The result is a transformation or even a transfiguration of local traditions. This is inevitable. This is part of what we see happening and has happened all over the world. What we see today is that particular forms of what is seen as free religion are empowered and elevated and privileged, while others are set aside. And of course, the definition of what is a free religion is what is at stake here. Let me just conclude, the Queen, by returning to the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. What is the conception of freedom underlying the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation's efforts? The market, market-based freedom, a market-based sense of freedom. Religion and religious freedom in this model are simply objects that you can go out and shop for in a marketplace of belief and unbelief. There are lots and lots of options on the shelves unless they threaten U.S. security, powerful state or corporate interests, or are perceived to be causes of terrorism defined by those interests, in which case they're quickly removed from the shelf and are no longer for sale and don't count as belief. Instead, they count as they could be any sort of ideology or dangerous, violent, extremist ideology. So as you can see here, guaranteeing religious freedom is a political project. It puts in place and enables particular ways of defining religion, of being religious, of being human, and it disables others. We think of religious freedom as a guarantee of the worth of the individual's desires. When taken up as a political project, however, my work suggests that it becomes a story of the US telling people how to be religious, how to be modern, and what it means to be free. In its most insistent moments, the globalization of religious freedom is a story of the cost in human dignity and diversity that come with the attempt to make belief the measure of what religion is understood to be, and the freedom to believe the measure of what it means to be free. Thank you. I think we're going to take some questions and comments.
If it's so important to American government for other countries to have religious freedom, what about countries that inherently don't have religious freedom, like don't have separation of church and state? Israel, a lot of the Arab countries, things like that.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that the sort of divide that you're expressing here between, well, is this something that the US should be involved in at all, or is this something that we should let people sort out on their own, is definitely something that gets argued over in Washington. But I would say that particularly since the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act was passed, it became the law for the US to promote religious freedom. So whether people thought it was a good idea or not, it was something that was going to happen, and people struggle and struggle, and I have another talk on those struggles, to define what it is on earth that they're promoting, because no one can really agree, and it's very different in different cultural contexts, as you pointed out. On the other hand, another side to your comment / question is, what about countries that don't have religious freedom? One of the problems with these programs, I think, is in the focus on religion as the problem or the solution. Bad religion as the problem and good religion as the solution, and good religious governance as the solution and bad religious governance as the problem. We lose sight of that much bigger picture that I was talking about when I was talking about Guatemala. We lose sight of corporate interests, state interests. We lose sight of all of the politics and history, and we become kind of narrowly focused on the question of how do people get along between religions. And I think that that question often distracts us from a much bigger picture that we need to consider when we think about how we're going to deal with American foreign policy toward Israel, for example. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for your question.
Oh, I do.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry. So I'm trying to grasp various points that you're making, and there are kind of two that I'm having trouble with, and I was thinking if you could give me an example of the other side, it might be helpful.
Okay, sure.
So one, you talked about, okay, so religion is defined as belief. So if you could give me some examples of other ways that you conceptually religion, intellectually, whatever you want to call it, could be defined. So that was one question. And the second one was, so you were discussing about in India and Hindu and the way, and how that definition of belief went into the definition of what Hinduism was, and the effect it had. And again, if you could be a little bit more specific with, so how that impacted, what pieces of Hindu weren't, what the other side of it, what, if it hadn't been that way, then what might it have looked like? So I can get the either or a little.
So in terms of thinking about, thanks for your questions. In terms of thinking about religion beyond belief, which is part of the title of my talk, there are many different ways that scholars can conceptualize religion. It could be a question of practice, of focus on ritual, a focus on embodiment, a more relational focus on ethics. There could be a number of, quote, religious traditions, if you want to call them that, ways of life that don't even require belief, that don't even put an emphasis on belief, that they're not that worried about believing and unbelieving, but it's much more about communal membership or practice or ritual or tradition or ways of relating to others. So those are some of the other ways of thinking about religion outside of belief. There's, of course, an enormous literature on this, as there is an enormous literature on colonial legal and religious reform in India and in other parts of the world as well. I picked just one very quick example here. But I would say that the point there that I'm trying to make, and there's a lot of things that a lot of different things we could do with that really interesting history that the legal historians are bringing to our attention. But what I'm trying to do with it is to suggest that when the US government goes into another country, it could be India, it could be one of the other countries that we're very active in, whether we're occupying it, for example, so Iraq, Afghanistan. When we go and we see a religious field, or how do we define the religious field? We understand it as what people believe, what institutions they belong to, what leaders they bow down to or they go and ask for advice from. We tend to view their religious field through a European Protestant lens. That's not to say there aren't exceptions, but for the most part, that when the US military goes in and we bring our chaplains with us, and this is a whole other very interesting story because the chaplains have been, since 2004 actually, they've been given a new set of jobs. When the troops go in, the chaplains go with them. Their job used to be to provide basically to minister to the religious needs of U.S. troops and their families who were stationed overseas and couldn't access the free religious marketplace that we have here at home. Now, the chaplains have a whole new sort of job description, and they're actually assigned to be community liaisons and to do outreach and to try to build bridges with religious communities. Now, when they do that, most of them, now not all of them are Protestant. We have Hindu chaplains. We have all kinds of different chaplains represented. We even now have an atheist chaplain in the military. He's in there. I'm pretty sure it's a he. People come, though, with their own ways, their own lenses, their own prisms through which they view the world, and tend to organize things the way that they're accustomed to organizing at home. So how do you define what's religious and what's political? How do you define what's the realm of the law and what's the realm of religion? Those sorts of divisions are the really big divisions that de Roover was talking about in terms of British colonial legal authority in India. And what I'm suggesting is that we can see parallel, though not identical, but parallel, interestingly similar dynamics in the U.S. promotion of religious freedom abroad, in that we go in with certain assumptions and we try to reorder societies based on our own experience and our own assumptions. And that it transforms them. And it's not to say that it's all good or all bad. It's always a mix, right? I mean, it's never perfect. But it does, and we do transform these societies, and we do rewrite the laws, and it does create kind of new realities for the people living in those places.
Should religion be redefined, and not just including belief, but also culture, tradition, and lifestyle, and add that to belief? That would simply change our approach to religion, because we even have this problem domestically with Standing Rock.
Of course. Standing Rock is a really interesting case. I teach that case as we try to think about non-Western religions and spiritualities. When you say redefined, I think for scholars of religion and for people who study these issues, and going back to this lady's first question, it already has been redefined, just along the lines that you're describing. People are really not so rigid about the boundaries. As scholars, we tend to think of practice and culture and, in historically received traditions, and we try to think about all of those things when we think about the definition of religion. When you think about it from a more legal perspective or a governance perspective, though, my broader point was that in order to define religion legally, in order to define religious freedom, we've got to define something called religion. And who is going to be that? Who's going to be that authority, given that we have disestablishment? Who's going to be the one to say that this is orthodox and that's unorthodox, that this is inside the box and that's outside and that's beyond the pale? So those kinds of determinations, drawing those lines, is something that I think American disestablishment aspires to, but has never really been able to achieve, because, as I said, religion isn't fully disestablished. It's been differently established, and it's established in a very particular ways that we talk about religion and decide who has beliefs, like I said, corporations right now. So those decisions are constantly being navigated and contested and argued over, and precisely because of some of the points that you're making, that it is a much more capacious and messy concept than narrowing it down to belief would suggest. So, thank you.
What was the impetus behind the 1998 law, and how has its implementation or emphasis changed as administrations have changed in the U.S.?
That's a great question. Did you all hear what was the impetus behind the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act? There were a number of different constituencies that were supporting that act. In part, it was a result of what was going on in Darfur. There were numerous kind of strange bedfellows that came together to advocate for the rights of persecuted Christians. And originally, the act was very specific and very narrow in terms of singling out persecuted Christians and the need to protect them. As the legislation developed, it was broadened and softened a little away from such a narrow focus on persecuted Christians to encompass persecuted minorities more generally, and then to support religious freedom very, very broadly. in terms of how the changes over time, that's a really interesting question. Right now, the landscape is changing very, very quickly in that some of the religion bureaucracy that was set up under Obama has been simply abolished. And ironically, for me anyway, from where I stand politically, which is not in support of the current administration, this was a good thing. Because so this is a very complicated question. But I would say, if to speak in broad terms, there's very, very little dissensus, bipartisan dissensus on this issue. Religious freedom is something that from left to right, people have tended to rally around in a sort of bipartisan effort. It has not been particularly contentious. There are certain constituencies that are more vocal than others in advocating for these offices to be more active and to do more work and to have more money and to have more resources and to have a direct line to the secretary. But for the most part, they kind of muddle along at the State Department, and they issue these reports, and they make a lot of people angry in other countries. China, for example, is like, give me a break. We don't care what you think about what we're doing inside our country. We just don't care. And, we know what sort of, economic interdependency we have with you, and so, just take it easy. So there's a lot of politics that go on in the writing of these reports. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes redactions that go on. I've interviewed some of the younger Foreign Service officers who get stuck with the unfortunate job of having to author the reports, which, for example, at a place like Egypt is extremely, extremely political. So what you say in that report about the government may not be acceptable to the government, and there may have to be sort of backdoor deals about what gets revealed in the report and what doesn't. So all of this is extremely politicized, but the general thrust of it, the game keeps going despite the administration is changing. However, I do think with this administration, there's a lack of authority and governance. It's literally chaos at the State Department. There's no one in place to make the decisions, which, I'm not passing judgment. I'm just sort of an observer. And so there is no one in the critical post. We have ambassadorships unfilled. We have people stepping down. We have, just chaos. So it remains to be seen what will happen. And I think probably religious freedom will not be the most important thing on the agenda. So be that as it may. There's a person up here, if you guys.
I'm curious, have you had much of an opportunity to speak with people in the communities around the United States about the openness to other forms of religious belief and religious definitions? You spoke about the military, and I'm aware a few years ago at the Academy in Colorado, there was a big kerfluffle about a certain kind of Christianity was being pushed.
Yes.
And how do you engage people who feel so definitely about a certain kind of religious practice when you say there are all these other kinds of religious practice that are appropriate and clearly followed in other cultures? And yet, when I've tried to talk with people on those issues, and it becomes, well, no, there's just one way of thinking.
So that's a really great question. I think if I could answer that successfully, I don't know where I would be, but I would be much more than teaching at Northwestern. It's just an incredibly difficult thing. What I found, I would say, is that telling people stories, telling them stories that try to illustrate what you're trying to show rather than telling them what they should think, that tries to give an example that doesn't necessarily involve their own tradition, but might involve one that they're sympathetic to and that they could sort of relate to, and try to show just some of the complexities that are involved and some of the differences that people have to navigate in their lives. But it can be very complicated. And I have to say that in my experience studying the US government, the military, although they get a lot of bad press, is often one of the places where they really are also, on the other hand, also trying really hard to sort out precisely this issue. So it is never black and white. And I think that if you get inside an institution, like the chaplaincy, for example, people there are struggling just as much as the rest of us to try to sort out how do we support people who are genuinely in need of support and who may come from any faith tradition. How do you train a person who can be that person so that whoever walks through that door and needs support, they can support them without proselytizing, but still giving them real substantive support in a tradition that resonates with them. Now, this is the challenge of the contemporary chaplaincy, and chaplaincy is not just in the military. They're in the Park Service, they're here at Northwestern, they're in all the hospitals. This is the kind of pivot point that we can see kind of in contemporary life between religion and public life, where you see the complexities of a religiously diverse society and the ways that government tries to both serve people but not necessarily impose on them. And it's a messy kind of, it's a messy picture. And so I guess to try to convey some of that to people. But no, and I also don't go around preaching the gospel. I tend to present, this is sort of where my research leads me. And so I'm not trying to necessarily, change how people think about themselves as much as I am trying to help them to unlearn some of the things that we've learned as kids about America and about religious freedom and about foreign policy.
Is religious freedom a precedent that's necessary for democracy?
Well, I think it's impossible. I think that as I've sort of been explaining or discussing or explicating over the past 30 minutes or so, I think that as an abstract ideal, religious freedom is an impossibility, because as I just said, if you are going to have religious freedom, you have to have a definition, a working definition of religion, and that is an inherently discriminatory process, because someone's religion is going to be left out, or some dissenter, or someone who's different, or some sect that doesn't comply with whoever defines orthodoxy. So the complexities and instabilities of the category itself make, I think, religious freedom an impossibility practically, legally. I think that we need other ways to talk about how to live together with difference.
All right.
Thanks.